In the land of opportunity, some men chase the American dream. Others, they sell it by the kilo. Weymouth, Massachusetts, 1942. The war still raged across oceans, and back home, in a small working-class neighborhood where dreams came to die quietly, George Jacob Jung entered a world that would never be enough for him. His father, Fred Jung, was a good man, the kind who worked himself to exhaustion, who believed in honesty and hard labor, who did everything right and still ended up with nothing. His mother, Erminalia, was different. She wanted more. She needed more. And when the money ran out, so did her respect for the man who couldn't provide it. Young George watched his father break under the weight of failure. He watched bill collectors knock on doors, watched his mother's cold disappointment, watched the American dream reveal itself as a lie told to keep poor men working. And in that small house filled with tension and unpaid debts, a seed was planted in the boy's mind. Money isn't everything, unless you don't have any. His father told him once, with tired eyes and calloused hands, "Money isn't the most important thing in life, George, but it's right up there with oxygen." The old man meant it as wisdom. George heard it as permission. School bored him. Authority annoyed him. The straight path his father walked led nowhere but exhaustion and shame. So George looked elsewhere, toward the ocean, toward the sun, toward California, where the 1960s were exploding in color and rebellion and a new kind of freedom that smelled like pot smoke and tasted like revolution. 1968, Manhattan Beach, California. While America tore itself apart over Vietnam and civil rights, while students burned draft cards and parents clutched pearls, George Jung found paradise. The beach, the girls, the endless summer, and pot. Beautiful, harmless, profitable pot that grew wild in Mexico and sold for fortunes in the land of Hollywood dreams. He wasn't a dealer at first. He was a lifestyle enthusiast, a beach bum with ambition, a charming pretty boy who understood something fundamental. People wanted to feel good, and he could help them, for a price. He started small, buying pot in Mexico, stuffing it into his car, driving it across the border where guards waved him through with bored expressions. 20 pounds became 50. 50 became 100. But George Jung wasn't built for small time. While other dealers sold ounces on street corners, he thought in tons. He recruited a crew, pretty stewardesses with innocent faces and empty suitcases, surfers who knew the Baja coastline like the backs of their hands, pilots who didn't ask questions when cash appeared. Within months, he controlled the California pot market. Within a year, he was a millionaire. The money came so fast it didn't feel real. Suitcases full of cash, houses purchased without mortgages, cars that cost more than his father made in a lifetime. And women, God, the women, drawn to power and money like moths to a flame that would eventually burn them all. But pot was just the beginning. George Jung had discovered something more valuable than the stuff itself. He had discovered the infrastructure of desire. Americans wanted to get high, and the government's war on stuff only made it more profitable. Supply and demand. Economics 101. The American dream repackaged and rolled into a joint. 1974. George was in Danbury Federal Prison, doing time for a pot bust that should have ended his career. But prison, for men like George, wasn't punishment. It was networking. And in those cells and common rooms, smoking cigarettes and playing cards, he met a man who would change everything. Carlos Leder Rivas, a young Colombian with crazy eyes and crazier dreams. Carlos talked about powder, not pot, powder. The white gold from Colombia that made pot look like child's play. He talked about Pablo Escobar, about the Medellín cartel, about mountains of powder waiting in South America with nowhere to go. George listened, and in his mind, the pieces clicked together like a lock opening to reveal treasure. Carlos had the product. George had the distribution network. Together, they would build an empire. When they got out, George flew to Colombia. The moment he landed in Medellín, he knew he'd entered a different world. This wasn't California beach culture. This was a country where violence was currency and life was cheap. But the powder, Jesus, the powder was everywhere. Pure, white, endless. And Pablo Escobar, the rising king of Colombia's underworld, needed someone who could move it into America in quantities that mattered. George pitched his plan. Use private planes to fly the powder from Colombia to the United States, landing in remote airstrips where no one asked questions. Cut out the middlemen, control the supply chain, flood the American market. Escobar listened with the focus of a predator. Then he smiled. And George Jung became the connection between Colombia and America, the bridge over which billions of dollars of powder would flow. Late 1970s into the early 1980s. These were George Jung's golden years, when he stood at the center of the powder universe and everything he touched turned to cash. The operation was beautiful in its simplicity. Planes loaded with hundreds of kilos of pure Colombian powder would fly north, landing in California, Massachusetts, anywhere George had connections. The stuff moved through his network like water through pipes, smooth, fast, unstoppable. George wasn't just a smuggler anymore. He was an executive. He had legitimate businesses as fronts, real estate investments, offshore accounts. He dressed in expensive suits, ate at the finest restaurants, dated models and actresses. The poor kid from Massachusetts who watched his father beg for money was now so rich he couldn't count it fast enough. He once made $15 million in a single afternoon. $15 million. In one day. But the money wasn't the high. The game was the high. The rush of outsmarting the DEA, of watching tons of powder disappear into America's hungry nose, of knowing he was untouchable. George Jung had become what he'd always wanted to be. More successful than his father ever dreamed possible, richer than the people who'd looked down on his family, free from the cage of poverty that had crushed his old man's spirit. At his peak, he was importing 85% of America's powder supply. 85%. He was personally responsible for making powder accessible to the American middle class, turning it from a celebrity substance into an epidemic. Movie stars, Wall Street bankers, suburban housewives, they were all getting high on George Jung's product, and he was getting rich beyond imagination. And the Colombians loved him. Pablo Escobar personally trusted him with millions in product. Carlos later treated him like a brother. In Colombia, George wasn't just the American connection. He was a hero, the gringo who could do what no one else could. Make America's appetite for powder profitable on an unimaginable scale. But empires built on powder always crack. The higher George climbed, the more paranoid he became. The DEA was circling. Rivals were jealous. Partners were getting sloppy. And George, despite his success, was making the classic mistakes of men who think they're invincible. He met Mirtha, a beautiful, wild Cuban-American woman who matched his appetite for excess. They fell into a love affair fueled by powder, parties, and pure adrenaline. They got married, had a daughter named Christina Sunshine Jung, a little girl born into a world of dirty money and beautiful lies. George loved that child with the only pure part of his heart that remained. She was his redemption, his hope, his reason to believe he could be more than a criminal. But Mirtha was also his weakness. She used the stuff as much as he sold it. Their fights were legendary. Screaming matches in mansions, powder scattered on marble counters, money thrown around like confetti while their daughter watched from doorways, too young to understand but old enough to remember. George tried to balance it all. Be a father, be a husband, be a smuggler moving tons of powder, be the connection between Colombia and America, be everything to everyone. But the powder that made him rich was also eating him alive. He started using more, trusting less, making decisions based on paranoia rather than logic. The parties got wilder. Money flowed like water, millions spent on cars, houses, anything to fill the void that kept growing despite the success. And always, in the back of his mind, was his father's voice. Money isn't everything, George. But George couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting the old man was right. 1987, the DEA had been patient. They'd watched George Jung for years, building a case brick by brick, wiretap by wiretap. They knew his roots, his partners, his methods. They knew everything except where he'd be at any given moment. But everyone breaks eventually. And the thing that broke George Jung wasn't the DEA's competence. It was his own people's weakness. Someone flipped. A partner, scared of prison time, made a deal. Then another, then another. George's network collapsed like a house of cards. George got sloppy. Desperate men make desperate mistakes, and George was running out of options. He tried one more big score, a massive shipment that would set him up for life, let him disappear with his daughter, start over somewhere the DEA couldn't reach. It was a setup. Of course it was a setup. The people he trusted had already sold him out. The DEA was waiting. When they kicked in the door, George Jung didn't run, didn't fight. He just sat there, surrounded by suitcases full of powder and cash, and surrendered to the inevitable. Prison. Again. But this time it was different. George Jung was no longer the young hustler networking his way to bigger opportunities. He was a middle-aged convict facing decades behind bars, watching the world move on without him. His empire was gone, his marriage was destroyed, and his daughter was growing up without him, learning to hate the name George Jung. He got out in 1995 after serving time, clean and supposedly reformed. He tried to reconnect with Christina, tried to be the father he'd never really been, but the streets were calling. Within months, he was back in the game. Not powder this time, but pot. He thought he could do it smarter this time, safer. He was wrong. 1999, George Jung was arrested again, this time for conspiracy to smuggle pot. At his trial, the prosecutors painted him as a kingpin who'd flooded America with poison. George's defense was simple. He was a businessman who'd operated in an illegal market, but he'd never hurt anyone directly. The judge wasn't impressed. George Jung was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison. 60 years. He was in his 50s. It was a life sentence disguised as a number. And that's when the walls finally closed in completely. In his cell, George Jung had nothing but time to think about his choices. His father, dead now, had been right all along. The money hadn't mattered. What mattered was the daughter who wouldn't take his calls. The life he'd wasted chasing a high that was never about the stuff. It was about proving he was more than the poor kid from Massachusetts. 2001. While George sat in prison, Blow premiered in theaters across America. Johnny Depp played him. Penelope Cruz played Mirtha. Hollywood had turned his life into a blockbuster, a tragic tale of ambition and downfall. George watched it in prison, and for the first time, he saw himself as others did. Not as a brilliant smuggler, but as a deeply flawed man who'd sacrificed everything real for something that was never real to begin with. The movie was successful. Critics praised Depp's performance, but the real George Jung remained in a cell, watching his legend grow while his life rotted away. The irony was suffocating. He was more famous in prison than he'd ever been as a free man. He'd achieved a kind of immortality, and it meant absolutely nothing. His daughter Christina saw the movie. For years, she'd hated him. The movie softened something in her heart. Not forgiveness, but understanding. She began writing to him. Slowly, painfully, they rebuilt some fragment of the relationship that stuff had destroyed. 2014. After serving 20 years, George Jung was released early. He walked out of Fort Dix Federal Correctional Institution on June 2nd, a 71-year-old man stepping into a world he barely recognized. Smartphones, social media, legal pot in Colorado and Washington. The very stuff that had put him in prison was now being sold in stores with government approval. The irony was a knife in the ribs. Everything he'd gone to prison for was slowly becoming legal. But George Jung had no place in that industry. He was a relic, a ghost from a time when smuggling meant something. He tried to adjust. His daughter Christina was there, older now, with her own life. They had a relationship, fragile, careful, built on the ruins of what should have been. George became a minor celebrity. He did interviews, appeared at conventions, signed autographs for people who'd seen Blow, and thought his life was romantic. He lived quietly in California, back where it all began. He wasn't rich. The government had taken everything. He was just an old man with stories, trying to find meaning in a life that had been defined by its meaninglessness. May 5th, 2021. George Jung died at his home in Weymouth, Massachusetts, the same town where he'd been born 78 years earlier. He'd come full circle. The cause of death was liver and kidney failure, his body finally giving up after decades of abuse. There was no funeral fit for a smuggler king, no cartel sending flowers, no Hollywood stars paying respects. Just a quiet death in the town that had shaped him. The news spread across social media. Johnny Depp posted a tribute. People who'd never met him mourned the passing of a man they knew only through a movie. But those who knew him understood the truth. George Jung died the same way his father had, broke, tired, and wondering if any of it had been worth it. The difference was that George had taken the long road to the same destination, trading quiet dignity for loud infamy, trading present love for future regret. His daughter inherited his story, but not his sins. She'd built a life separate from his legend, raised her own children to know their grandfather as a cautionary tale rather than a hero. The cycle ended with her. The Jung family's criminal chapter closed with George's last breath. George Jung didn't invent powder smuggling, but he perfected it. Before him, the stuff came in small quantities, expensive and exclusive. After him, it flooded America, democratizing the high. He personally imported an estimated $100 million worth of powder during his career. Conservative estimates say more. His real legacy isn't in the pounds and kilos, it's in the blueprint he created. George Jung proved that with the right connections and audacity, one person could challenge the government's monopoly. The cartels that came after him used his methods. Airplanes, remote landing strips, corrupt officials. They just did it bigger, more violently. George Jung was the last romantic smuggler. He believed in the hustle, the game, the artistry of outsmarting the system. The men who followed believed only in money and murder. His story became myth, then legend, then entertainment. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was a man who wanted more than his circumstances allowed, who found a way to get it, who discovered too late that getting what you want isn't the same as wanting what you get. George Jung is the American dream through a mirror darkly. He started with nothing, built an empire through wit and work, became wealthy, and lost it all. That's the classic American story, except George's empire was illegal and his wealth was blood money. But is he really so different from the robber barons who built America's legitimate fortunes? They broke laws, bribed officials, destroyed competitors, and died as respected captains of industry. George did the same things but chose the wrong industry. The methods were identical, only the product was different. That's what made George Jung dangerous to the establishment. He proved that the system's rules were arbitrary. His life asks uncomfortable questions. What if the war on stuff is a failure by design? What if George Jung was just a convenient scapegoat for a problem that existed long before him and continues long after? George Jung spent his life running from his father's failure, only to end up with his own version of the same thing. Fred Jung died broke and unappreciated. George Jung died broke and infamous. Different paths, same destination. The cruelest irony is that George's success was built on rejecting everything his father represented. And when it all collapsed, what George needed most was exactly what his father had tried to teach him: that love and family matter more than money, that the respect of your children is worth more than the respect of criminals. Fred Jung never got to say, "I told you so." He died while George was still flying high. By the time George understood his father's wisdom, his own daughter had learned the same lesson, that having a father present is better than having a father who's rich but gone. Christina chose forgiveness, but not the kind that excuses or forgets. She forgave him so she could be free of the anger, so her children wouldn't inherit the resentment, so the Jung family could finally break the pattern. 3 generations, 3 approaches to escaping poverty. The cycle ended because someone finally said, enough. George Jung didn't create America's appetite for powder. He fed it. The demand was already there, in corporate boardrooms, Hollywood parties, university campuses. Americans wanted to feel invincible, energetic, euphoric. Powder promised all of that, and George delivered. The human cost was enormous: addiction, overdoses, broken families. Children growing up with parents who loved powder more than they loved their kids, just like Christina grew up with a father who loved the game more than he loved her. George never pulled a trigger, never forced anyone to use anything, but the powder he imported destroyed lives by the thousands. Late at night, in prison, with nothing to do but think, the lies stopped working. The faces of people he'd never met haunted him. Addicts who'd lost everything, families torn apart, lives ruined. Not directly by him, but by the powder pipeline he'd built and perfected. There's no redemption for that, only regret. George Jung died the same way his father did: broke, tired, wondering if the journey had been worth the destination. But Fred Jung died with dignity. George died with infamy. His father left behind a lesson about honest work and family values. George left behind a movie, some stories, and a daughter who had to forgive him to free herself. He smuggled enough powder to get a nation high and ended up in a cell getting low. He made millions and died with nothing. He was loved by thousands who never met him, and barely known by the daughter who mattered most. He beat the system until the system beat him back. He lived the American dream in reverse, starting with nothing, building an empire, ending with less than nothing. The man, the myth, the cautionary tale. Some men chase money, some men chase respect. But the smartest men, they stay home with their kids and realize they already have everything that matters. I learned that lesson. Just 40 years, too late. Boston. George is gone. But the powder he moved, the pipeline he built, the lesson he taught, they remain. Not because he was special, but because he proved that anyone with ambition and desperation can become a king. And any king can become a prisoner. The throne and the cell are closer than they appear. Was it worth it? The answer died with him. But his daughter knows the truth, and she's never touching the stuff.